Thanks. Well, I just wanted to start off by welcoming everyone to this evening's online talk hosted by the Young Greens and Katrina, called Ecosocialism and a Green New Deal, although I probably would prefer the term socialist eco, but since it doesn't sound great, it hasn't really been coined yet. And I think like the Green New Deal in itself, as we'll get into today, we're talking about a green and socialist, or a socialist and green New Deal, even though the word socialist isn't in there. But it's so lovely to see all of you this evening, so many of you, over 60 of you, and I'm so grateful to you for giving up your time, despite the lockdown, when there's lots on Netflix, to join us this evening to hopefully put our heads together to strategize on how to improve people's lives and stop this climate crisis in its tracks. And thanks for having me. I don't pretend that I'm going to have all the answers, but I'm just going to give you a few of my own thoughts, and then hopefully we can engage in a good Q&A afterwards. So first of all, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Alex Phillips, former MEP for the South East of England, not to be confused with the former Brexit Party MEP representing the same region with the same name. And I'm Mayor of Brighton Hove until last week. I'm still a councillor there, sitting on the housing committee and focusing my efforts on tackling homelessness, which, let's face it, cannot be described as anything other than a national scandal. So, although now the concept of a Green New Deal is relatively well known, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez pushing for it in the US, the European Commission talking about it, and even the Labour Party having their own version of it in the form of a green industrial revolution, I first came across the Green New Deal back in 2007. I was working for Caroline Lucas, the then MEP in the European Parliament, and it was something that she was working on alongside well-known economists and the like, including Anne Pettifor from Operation Noah, Larry Elliott, economics editor of The Guardian, and Jeremy Leggett from Solar Century, to name but a few. Back then in 2008, their version of a Green New Deal was really a solution to solve the triple crunch of the credit crisis, the climate change crisis, and high oil prices. At the time, it didn't take off as you might have expected. And I think that's because, and this is just my own thoughts, like looking back on the time, I think it's because the climate crisis just wasn't taken seriously back then. But since then, so much has happened. We've had the 2019 report from the International Panel on Climate Change explaining that we've just got 10 years or less now left to get our house in order on tackling climate change, after which it would simply be too late to halt the worst damage that it will cause. And that means that large parts of the world will become uninhabitable in my son's lifetime at the end of this century. And this is why I think the Green New Deal is now taking off. It's because the science is clear. But when I say it's taking off, it's only really taking off in name only. People are talking about it, but there's not a huge amount of action behind that. When I was an MEP, one of my biggest achievements was bringing politicians together from different groupings to form a cross-party, or intergroup as they called them, there on a Green New Deal. And it was wonderful to have been involved in its conception. And I'm just so sad that I can only follow its work from afar these days. But it's a fantastic legacy for a relatively short time as an MEP. So now we're against this awful backdrop of the coronavirus. All of the flaws in our neoliberal economic system have been clearly exposed. Its insatiable need for economic growth at the cost of people and planet. And it's astounding that things have had to come to this, a global pandemic on a scale never seen before, for us as a society to sit back and question how we have constructed our world to work. So it is the perfect opportunity as well for us to ensure that recovery from this current catastrophe isn't one of more capitalist growth, inequality and climate disaster, but one of prosperity and dignity for all, equality and respect for our environment. And that's why I believe that a radical Green New Deal is the only way to deliver this. A strategy that boosts the economy at the same time as revitalising our public services through public ownership for the most part, but there are the odd, community interest company that does a good job too, tackling the climate crisis and ensuring a fair transition for workers of all nations. Anything less will lead to not only recession, but in my view, depression, and will kill, as austerity has in the past and continues to do. And now on to the science. It's clear, if we fail to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, which seems very likely, we will face catastrophe on an unprecedented scale. And a Green New Deal meets the scale of this challenge, making the transition to renewable energy, investing in an energy efficient workforce, greening our transport system, and creating 1 million new jobs. This would mean an end to using coal, an end to fracking, because we must keep fossil fuels in the ground. Not only would a Green New Deal see huge investment in renewable energy, efficiency measures would lower the bills of everyday people, properly insulate the homes of millions, and take people out of the fuel poverty that kills up and down this country each year. A Green New Deal would provide good, secure jobs and work with trade unions at its heart to ensure that people working in the old fuel industries are taken care of, offered the opportunity to retire with dignity, or retrain to work in the renewable energy sector. Now, we must strive to make this a truly green and social New Deal. We must combat the narrative that growth is the only measure of success. And that is why we need to be working cross-party and on an international scale to tackle the triple crises that we now face of Corona, the economy, and the climate. So how will we build a Green New Deal, and what does it look like in the current crisis? So protecting people's lives, making them enjoyable, and getting to net zero by 2030 covers at least, I would say, the following 5 or 6 sectors. So we have energy use, buildings, both domestic and commercial, transport, industry, land use. But for me, a green and social New Deal also it's holistic, and it looks at jobs that we need both now and in the future that aren't perhaps the most obvious low carbon jobs, but things like nursing, caring for other people, the things that we've seen in this crisis, as Katrina has mentioned, that have been at the forefront of what we require in order to function properly as a society, those key workers. So I'll cover the more traditional aspects of a Green New Deal first, and then I'll go on to those sorts of broader areas. So I'll cover energy and buildings first, all of which will contribute to lowering people's bills, as I've already said, and taking them out of fuel poverty, so they don't have to decide on whether to heat or eat. This will have a tremendously positive, direct impact on so many people in the UK, and it is what any civilized society needs to do in order to protect its people and ensure they prosper, are fulfilled, and crucially, enjoy their lives. The transformation of energy production from fossil fuels to renewables would include upgrades to the national grid, increased improvements to energy storage, renewable energy generation capacity. On top of this, there needs to be what is often referred to as a just transition or a fair transition. I don't really like those terms because I don't think that they mean that much to ordinary people. But for me, that would mean, for example, people currently working in the old energy systems would either be given enough money to retire in dignity, as I've said already, or the opportunity to retrain and get those new jobs in renewables. And that concept of a just transition applies to all of the other areas that I'll be focusing on here, but it is best covered under the section of industry, which I'll get onto after discussing buildings. So in order to retrofit all 27 million UK homes, we need 10 million of those existing homes to have what we call a deep retrofit, which includes insulation, double glazing, refitted energy systems, gas to electric. 17 million homes to have a lighter retrofit to improve energy systems and efficiency, because many homes already have loft, cavity wall and solid wall insulation and double glazing and the like. But in order to retrofit non-domestic buildings, we would need to create a huge pot of money for that. We're talking, in all of these sections, what we're talking about is billions upon billions of pounds. And we also need to be creating 100,000 new social homes per year to a thing called passive house standard, which is basically when homes are designed from scratch to be the most efficient that they can be, depending on how, which way they're constructed, you know, their insulation, the windows. And people who live in passive houses in the UK often don't pay very much to heat them because they're just so incredibly efficient. And we need to create well-paid, secure jobs necessary for this transition, including things like trades and other manual skills. Research and development will be key, including in low carbon technology, investment in industrial processes. But I think a lot of that we would be expecting major private sector investment in high emission sectors. We'd be expecting that contribution. One of the biggest rethinks since the coronavirus and social distancing has been transport. I know this because my husband runs an electric fleet of buses that serve public bus routes in Brighton Hove, you know, subsidised by the council. And he also runs a thing called community transport, which might be you might see it also in places where you live. There are lots of them around the UK, and he does the one for kind of Brighton and Hove and surrounding areas. So, you know, the coronavirus, perhaps bad news for our traditional public transport, such as buses, trams and trains, but great news for reclaiming our road space for people so that we can walk, cycle, use wheelchairs and assisted mobility scooters safely. And we've seen some councils really go to town on that now, and other councils not doing so. Having said that, not everyone is able to walk or cycle to where they need to be every day due to a variety of factors, including age and fitness, weather appropriateness, and so forth. So we propose that there would be also a huge investment in railways, including a full electrification of the railways and the opening of new lines or reopening of old ones, as many of them were shut. I think it was in the 1950s or 60s. And some of those have been turned into cycle paths now, so obviously they wouldn't be reopened. And we'd have reduced transport fees, so that would mean that bus fares and rail fares would be significantly lower, but we'd also need to have an increase in bus journeys and train journeys. We'd be looking for the government to step in and for them not to be owned by the private sector, although I do think some operators like community interest companies you know, do a great job as well, that aren't, you know, private profit-making businesses. Because of social distancing, obviously you know, there needs to be either bigger vehicles, whether that be trams or trains or buses, and that's more costly. Or there needs to be more kind of frequent journeys across each of the routes, just to ensure that social distancing is adhered to properly. And then we've got things like electric vehicle infrastructure, and I don't really like talking about that so much because it is such a big focus from other political parties when they talk about transport, you know, and greening the transport sector. They kind of jump to electric vehicle infrastructure. I'm not a massive fan of it, but you know, there does need to be some investment in that. But I suspect that the majority of that investment would come from the private sector, because they've got a lot to gain from it as well. And last but no means least, obviously walking and cycling infrastructure. The government's already promised some money towards that, but nowhere near enough to really reclaim our roads and have streets for people, which I think personally, as a bit of a transport buff and a keen cyclist and walker, that's incredibly exciting. And I can see lots of cities just transforming completely with that change alone. I mean, I've been talking for a while now. I've got information about land use and so on as well. I think, you know, there's less to do there, and it's more really about ensuring that, you know, we treat the land properly, and that there's more research and development in how we can do that. I think since lockdown, you know, a lot of people have seen a scarcity of food in supermarkets, and they've reflected more upon where food comes from and how they can get involved in perhaps growing their own food, even if they don't have access to their own open area, how we share food, that sort of thing. So they're the big meaty areas. There would need to be investment elsewhere, such as overseas development, you know, reducing the import of CO2 reduction, etc. But I think things like energy and transport seem to me, or seem to a lot of people, to be the most obvious, if you like, areas of a Green New Deal. That might be what comes to your mind first. But as I said earlier, for me, it needs to be completely holistic, which means it needs to touch on every aspect of society, improving people's lives and providing low carbon jobs right now, but also into the future. And going forward, you know, we will need more people training in health and care, for example, looking after others. This, for me, is also as much as a Green New Deal job as electrifying the train system is. So I think it also therefore needs to cover policy areas that we have as Greens, such as the universal basic income and the four-day working week. And for me, those two go hand in hand. They will provide a level of protection required that we have seen really lacking, and it's been completely exposed that during this current health crisis. And you know, if you take UBI on its own, because it would replace some of the existing benefits that we've got already, such as, you know, income tax and national insurance, it would only be about 36 billion, I think, more than what we already pay out in different types of benefits. And just yesterday, the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, who I really, really like, has released plans of a 4-day working week, and she is looking at employers to implement it to reboost the economy during this crisis, but also obviously improving people's well-being. Another tranche of the Green New Deal for me is clearly ending austerity, and I've touched on that a little bit, but it would need to be things like reversing local authority cuts, plugging the school funding gap, reversing cuts to adult education, increasing the investment into the NHS and obviously funding for nursing training, and increasing disability benefits. Now, ending austerity still seems a little bit controversial, given our current UK landscape, political landscape. And so for me, this does seem like it could be the most, bizarrely, it could be the most vulnerable area at the moment. And that's why we absolutely cannot allow the Tories to continue with austerity, when it will only lead to more misery, more unnecessary deaths, as well as not helping us recover from the COVID-19 crisis and just, you know, leading to depression. And there are other commitments as well that I quite like about abolishing school tuitions, fees, you know, student debt, free personal care for the elderly, free childcare and development, and other small commitments, which are also part of our manifesto. And a lot of the time we're asked, you know, how are we going to afford this sort of thing? And additional tax revenue includes things like legalized drug taxes and increasing alcohol duties, although that's not all of the money that we need. It's in other areas too. And we'd obviously have loads of savings, including reducing poverty, legalizing and regulating drugs, and ending air pollution. And the normal kind of spending cuts that Greens would be looking for in terms of scrapping Trident, scrapping internal NHS markets, which brings it back to, you know, proper public ownership, curtail new road building plans, abolish Help to Buy, abolish the HS2. And there'll be significant price changes. So it'll come to no surprise that it will cost more, you know, for things that pollute. So petrol, diesel, fossil fuels, flights, alcohol in supermarkets, and recreational drugs, but they'll also be safer. Things that'll cost less will be things like bus and train fares, household repairs, sports and entertainment tickets, hotel stays, alcohol and food in pubs, bars and restaurants when they open, as well as, you know, running small businesses, because they're the things that, you know, that we as Greens like to see. And so that's kind of the big picture. And when you narrow it down onto a city like Brighton and Hove, what would the gains look like? So obviously there'd be quite massive yearly gains for the council budget, schools, the local NHS, adult education, as I've mentioned, personal care for the elderly, home insulation or retrofit, more council homes, free childcare, woohoo, as well as walking and cycling infrastructure. So that we'd see a huge difference in a city like Brighton and Hove. But to specific individuals, and I think this is really important when trying to sell a Green New Deal, what would they see in a year that would be different? Well, workers in Brighton and Hove, their take-home pay would increase by 1,400 quid a year, which isn't bad. Rail commuters, of which there are a lot of them in Brighton, from Brighton to London, would have an £800 saving. Bus passes would be 150 quid cheaper. Graduates would save 300 quid a year based on the average salary. And people would save up to £8,000 in child costs, which is just huge. And on top of that, you know, the benefits of the universal basic income and a 4-day week. And what we would see in terms of households is that household incomes would vary, obviously, in improvement, but will range from, for example, a lone parent with one child with no income would be 4,700 quid better off. So they would have nearly £13,000. And a childless couple who perhaps have a £10,000 in earning would be £6,500 better off. And so their income would be 16,300 quid. So these are really, you know, significant increases for those in our society who are currently living on the breadline. And they will notice the biggest improvement in their lives. So now that I've kind of given you an overview of what a Green New Deal might look like on the kind of bigger level and then down into a city, how do we make it happen? That's the big question. Well, you know, the only way, I'm going to be honest, you know, the only way that I can see of us achieving all this in the timescale required is just to get rid of the Tories at the next general election, which is expected in the summer of 2024, but it could be as late as the winter of that year. And this would require us working with every other anti-Tory party across Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, to ensure that there is only one anti-Tory candidate to go up against the Tories in each constituency across the UK. And for those of you who might have followed me politically, you know, I am not usually a fan of pacts. I'm very publicly, I was very publicly against the so-called Remain Alliance Pact that was agreed with the Lib Dems who applied Cymru last year. However, I think if we're going to get rid of the Tories, and that is something that, you know, is at the forefront of my mind every day, that's what we have to do, then this is the only way to do it. And yes, it would mean a vast reduction in what's known as short money, so extra money for each vote that we get across the country. Every single vote, even outside of Brighton Pavilion, it contributes to extra money for Caroline, essentially, or for whomever is fighting Brighton Pavilion. So, you know, we'd lose a lot in terms of money, but personally, I think that it's worth it in order to prevent the destruction of people and the planet that this Tory government has embarked upon. And I think right now is the time to lead by example and do the work required to kick the Tories out. Thank you.